So good morning, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been in Australia about 48 hours, so if I'm a little addled, just bear with me. I don't think I know the future of journalism, but I'm certainly trying to figure it out. But as you heard, everything, I think, in everyone's career really is based on your experience. And I was incredibly fortunate as a 22-year-old, a few months out of university, to one night get a phone call. I was a copy boy at the Times, and on the phone, someone whose voice I didn't recognize said, we want you to come to room 1111 at the Hilton Hotel tomorrow, and don't tell anybody where you're going, not even your parents. I still lived at home, and bring enough clothes for a month. And I said, who is this? Actually, I cursed, rather inappropriately. And it was one of the editors at the Times, and he was serious. And within about 24 hours, I was Xeroxing the Pentagon Papers. And you can imagine being 22 years old and standing there with a big Xerox machine that was about 12 feet long in those days and had a green rays coming out of it. I thought it was sterilizing me. But I do have 3 kids. And literally reading documents that said, for your eyes only, top secret, Secretary of State, President of the United States. And the time frame for this is 1971, and in the United States, there were huge protests against the Vietnam War. People were in the streets, and 50,000 plus Americans and countless Vietnamese were being killed. So it was a pretty remarkable learning for me. And on top of that, I became part of a team. And really, the best journalism is created by teams. And the other thing, as part of this team, even though I was the junior member, every night at the end of very long days, sometimes we'd sit down and eat. It would be midnight or 12 o'clock in a suite of rooms that we had at the Hilton. And we would go over everything. And there was a tremendous sense of being open and listening and learning. And I was really informed as a very young man about values that stayed with me my entire career. One, it was the value of the free press. It was the value of investigative reporting, that journalists could make a difference, and that every member of every team had something of value that could be important to the story. And really at the core of everything was the story. I left the Times because I wanted to be a reporter. As you heard, I went to the Boston Globe and the Philadelphia Inquirer, where you could believe you could do anything. It was 1979. At that point, the Inquirer was probably the most interesting newspaper in the United States. It was a place of tremendous ambition and fun, which is really crucial for journalists. And without ever wanting to, or ever dreaming I would do it, I became eventually the editor of the Inquirer after being a foreign correspondent and doing a lot of investigative reporting. Becoming the editor of the Inquirer was probably something I thought I would do for the rest of my career. It was 1998. But what I really discovered was incredible conflict between the values of the newsroom, which are based on creativity and passion in the story, and the values of corporate ownership, where the core demand and the core goal was profit. And there was a tremendous disconnect, and I really had a hard time. I was the editor of a newsroom with 630 people, a big newsroom, a budget of $75 million. The Inquirer was owned by a company called Knight Ridder. Our profit margins were north of 20%, and they wanted to go higher and higher and higher. It was publicly traded. And when 2000 came and everything began to shake out, and the internet and classified began to move, newspapers began to see profit and revenue decline. And the way corporate media dealt with that was to downsize. I really opposed that. There was no strategic thinking. There was no looking ahead. And there was no thinking that we were making a product, journalism, that people really wanted, but they were figuring out a way to get it in different ways, which was obviously on the internet. So long story short, I was sacked, I guess you say here, at the end of 2001, and I had no idea what I would do. And I taught at Columbia, and I decided I had one more newspaper in me, and I ended up going to San Francisco to be the managing editor of the Chronicle. That didn't work out either, and in the middle of 2007, I left. And what I decided, I was not going to go back to a newspaper. I was not going to go into a situation where creativity ran into a wall, where the corporate thinking was really about what we used to do, not about what we could do, from my point of view, and where everything was driven by the first question in terms of innovation was, what will it cost? What's it going to do? It was very short-term thinking. And I ended up at the Center for Investigative Reporting because I really wanted to try and create a new model. I had no idea what I was getting into. CIR, as you heard, is the oldest nonprofit investigative organization in the United States. It was founded in 1977. When I got there, it was really a stressed situation. It was unclear whether we would survive. It was based on raising funds from philanthropic organizations and big foundations. And when I got there, what I really wanted to do was create a model where you take the core story, the investigation, and if you think about the spokes of a wheel, take that story, and it's happening now, and every spoke of the wheel is a different platform. So you take create a team around the story and push it out on every platform simultaneously. And you have to create an organization either through internal staff skills or through collaboration where you're working as a unit from the inception of the story to the time you're going to publish it across all platforms and reach the largest audience possible in the way the audience wants to receive the story. And this sounds, I think it makes more sense now than it did in 2008, almost 4 years ago. And the board of CIR was very skeptical this could happen. I set out to raise money. It was the beginning of 2008, and the financial markets were in total collapse. The first 18 months I was at CIR, we couldn't raise any money. Somehow we survived. I brought in a development officer, and by the end of 2009, we had gotten around $3 million, and we now have a staff of 32 people, which has grown from 7 people in 2008 and a budget of nearly $5 million. And what we are doing is a multi-platform approach to investigative reporting. The easiest way for you to understand that is we did a story. I'm going to show you something in a few minutes, and I am going to open us up to questions. But what we did last week, or the week of September 11th, about 6 months ago or longer, we obtained something called suspicious activity reports. In the United States, the Homeland Security Department created suspicious activity reports really to counter terrorism. And we FOIA'd, we did a Freedom of Information Act request to multiple police agencies across the United States. And one, I think inadvertently actually sent us a bunch of these police activity reports, which they probably weren't supposed to do. And we got 125 associated with the Mall of America. And we did a series of stories, and this is where the model really works. We took it to we have a very good relationship with National Public Radio and Public Broadcasting. We took the story to them around 6 months ago, and we said we want to work with them. Now, this involves a tremendous amount of trust. Simultaneously, in-house, we have the capability to produce broadcast video, animation, print stories, interactive multimedia with the documents. And when the story was released last week, it was in 2 segments on National Public Radio, one on All Things Considered. It was a 20-minute piece that actually had an intermission. There was a 9-minute piece on the morning edition the next day. It was broadcast nationally on public broadcasting. It was in newspapers around the United States. It was on multiple websites. It was pushed out through social media, through Facebook and Twitter, and conservatively probably reached an audience of 5 or 6 million people. Now, one of the things we also did, and I want to show you, is completely, when you think about the Pentagon Papers and how information was distributed, is really, I think, an innovative step. Animation, people are doing animation. But how do you simplify a very complicated story and get it to an audience that really doesn't care about reading long form, might not listen to public broadcasting, may not watch public television, is getting its information in completely different ways. So we are starting to play around with animation. And the complication here, and everything we do is cross-vetted. I mean, as you heard, credibility, we know, is the really central piece of any investigative journalism. And hopefully the perception that it's not biased, that it's impartial, and as an organization, investigative reporting organization, we don't want to be seen as partisan, either progressive or conservative. And in the States, as you know, and here, there's a polarization of news and information that's really very dangerous. So this animation is an attempt to push out the essence, in a sense, of a story to a different audience, and with the hope, and this is all very experimental, that an audience that might use this will be curious enough to go to some of the other elements of the story. So this was this was on the NPR site, it was on public broadcasting sites, it was on our site. But, after we look at this, I think I'll just open it up to questions. But again, if you think about where I come from in terms of Xerox and the Pentagon Papers and this, and giving up as a manager and a leader, I think one of the key things is to really give up what didn't work and really be open to risk-taking and experimentation in the new model. Now, I can answer questions about the complications of keeping this alive. in terms of securing the funding and, again, the philanthropic model. But one aside, we also, as a nonprofit, are charging for-profit news organizations for our content. And the reality right now is we're overwhelmed by the opportunities. So the key thing, our next step as a bunch of journalists, is to bring in people who can help us generate revenue. We're not good at that. I'm not a businessman. But we are talking now, I think actually someone from ABC blogged about it last week and got me in a lot of trouble, very early conversations with YouTube. Because we're in Northern California, we can really go open doors with a lot of the big tech companies, whether it's Yahoo or Google or Apple, and really they're trying to figure out how to help in the United States the nonprofit sector, especially around investigative reporting. But the key thing always for all of us is to tell the story in a lucid, coherent way and think how differently we all can use the evolution and evolving technology and really push things out on every platform. So that's central to what we're doing. So why don't you show this animation and then we'll open it up to Q&A.
Imagine you're on vacation with your family. You're visiting Las Vegas, Disney World, the Mall of America, or the Golden Gate Bridge. You take a photo, and that's when things get weird. A security guard stops you, wants to ask you questions. He writes down your name, the details on your driver's license, asks where you live, where you work. He reads your information into a radio. He says surveillance cameras captured you taking photos of a location considered vulnerable to security threats, like terrorism. Terrorism, you think? No, not me. He takes your camera, looks through the photos, and confiscates the memory card. He pats you down for weapons. Weapons? This is crazy, you say. What have I done wrong? It's entirely possible you've broken no known rules or laws at all. You didn't see any signs banning photos. But this is the new reality of a post-9/11 America. Let's rewind a bit. After the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, then-President George W. Bush deeply reorganized the federal government and created a massive new Department of Homeland Security. The U.S. government was determined never to miss intelligence again. No lead would be unfollowed, no stone unturned. Part of this new department's job was to give billions in Homeland Security grants to state and local agencies so they could participate in the fight against terrorism. Hundreds of millions of those dollars were used to build more than 70 intelligence fusion centers across the U.S. Inside these command centers, local police and sheriffs joined forces with the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and other federal agencies. Their mission is to collect, analyze, and share vast amounts of information about possible criminal and terrorist threats. And from their perspective, you could be one of them. See, after that security guard wrote down all of your personal information, it may have become a suspicious activity report, beginning a journey from his notepad to the local police department and then on to a fusion center. At the fusion center, your data can be put into a database, where it may be kept indefinitely. Your info could then be accessed by other law enforcement agencies, like nearby police departments and the FBI. An FBI agent could even come knocking at your door. This won't happen to everyone, but suspicious activity reporting appears to be on the rise. More than 15,000 reports are already stored in one national law enforcement database, with only half the states participating so far. In D.C., researchers examined 40,000 suspicious person and vehicle calls made over 20 months from 2005 to 2007. None were confirmed terrorist threats. 200 were deemed potential threats. Here's how it works. In LA, a dry cleaning employee found a thumb drive in a customer's dirty laundry. On it were photos of the Burbank airport. The employee called police, and they filed a suspicious activity report. At the Mall of America in Minnesota, an elderly Pakistani man left his cell phone on a food court table. When he came back for it, security guards had created a perimeter around the phone and other unattended items that weren't his. He was interrogated, and an FBI agent later showed up at his family's home. This is life in America since hijackers killed 3,000 people in terrorist attacks a decade ago. Since then, we've had no major attacks in the U.S. But civil liberties watchdogs say some of our basic freedoms may be at risk, like freedom of movement, freedom from harassment by police, and the right to be treated as innocent until proven guilty.
So you can see that's a very different way to take the essence of a story. That the print version of that was around 4,500 words, many minutes on radio, television. And again, it's something I never thought I would be involved in. But I really think as we're going forward, all of us really have to think about how you tell your story and reach the largest audience possible. And it's happening. And the essence of a lot of this is collaboration. We produced that in-house. We hired the illustrator. And Carrie Ching, whose voice you heard, the narrator, wrote the script. And it was vetted and matched up. Everything in there is based on information or facts that we obtained elsewhere. And if you go to the website, go to our website, and it's part of the Center for Investigative Reporting and the America's War Within, you'll see a tremendous amount of information substantiating everything, including one thing about what you can do as a citizen to find out if there's a suspicious activity report around about you. It is almost impossible, even if you're the subject of one, to even know about it or to get access to it. And one of the things we did, if you look at the stories we did, we found, because we had these reports, we tracked people down, and they didn't even know they were in the system. And we showed them the reports, some of which were 15, 20 pages long. You can imagine the reaction. As well as surveillance pictures taken of people in the mall, which you didn't even know were taken and were attached to these suspicious activity reports, many of which were for completely mundane and really sort of ludicrous things. So again, this is an attempt to try and reach a different audience, tell a story in a different way, and adapt it to the emerging and evolving technologies. So if you have questions, there are microphones, so just step up. I hope you have questions. I can keep talking. But I'd rather hear some questions. No questions? Someone has to start. Yeah, I'd like to hear your reaction because, one of the things we're trying not to do is be biased. And if there's a perception... The question is, do I think it's unbiased? Yeah, I think the attempt, I think the bias is in the eye of the beholder, but the attempt there was to try and make it unbiased. And again, I think this is an evolving way of storytelling. And I think there might have been stronger language. It's in there, but it's subtle about there have been no attacks, and sometimes suspicious activity reports there are suspicious activities, and that there is a legitimate reason, for law enforcement to be aware of that kind of thing. And I think that could have been a stronger element in that, to be honest. And I think also that, again, this is a new way of attempting something. And if you look at the body of work, obviously, it's in there. So I think some of this is a standalone piece of content or a story, and the other way to look at it is a large, very large package of information and material where, a lot of the questions I think you're alluding to are really clearly addressed. So, it's like if you think traditionally it's a multi-part series in a newspaper, if you read one element of it, you're not going to get the whole story. And I think part of the challenge here is how do you mesh into a sort of digestible form as many elements as you can in case someone's only looking at one piece of the story. So that's something we have to, keep thinking about and evolving. And a lot of this is, to be candid, it's the beginning of trying something different and seeing how it works.
Rob, I'm very interested in what you say about how you earn your money, which is selling to traditional media, coupled with your great interest now in using animation and cartoons. I read the 9/11 Commission report as a cartoon book format, and I was very interested in seeing or asking you whether you think that translating very complex issues in terms of animation or cartoons is where you're going to make a significant amount of your revenue from in the future.
We don't know the answer to that. If I knew the answer, I'd probably share it very openly, because I think one of the things in the States is what's happening is a tremendous amount of transparency between the nonprofits There's something called the Investigative News Network, which was just started about a year and a half ago. I'm on the board. It has 60 nonprofit investigative or news organizations in it. I think, just to be clear, with the amount of revenue we're generating from for-profits is only, if we're fortunate, we'd hope to get to 25 or 30% of revenue in the next couple of years, because it's just evolving. But we have a project that's focused on California, which obviously is the biggest, state in the country, where we have relationships and deals which generate revenue with 6 or 7 American broadcasting, not ABC, American ABC affiliates in the state. Some of our stories are published in as many as 20 or 25 newspapers simultaneously. There's a website, AOL has hyperlocal sites in the United States called patch.com. So we're taking macro issues and breaking them down to hyperlocal issues as part of our model, because you get communities involved and interested in a story which they may feel like they have no relationship to. So there are multiple ways we're trying to generate revenue. I'm not sure animation is the key. Some of you, your ABC blog last week was about an early conversation we had with YouTube. I would say classify everything we're doing as sort of in the innovative, creative, experimental stage. I would not have thought 3 years ago that we would have as many distribution partners on the same stories we have now. The concept of exclusivity has been shattered. I was stunned when we started. If you had asked me before we started this California Watch project, how many newspapers, for example, would run one of our stories in a state the size of California, I would have said a handful. But what's happened is the news organizations want our stories because they're unique, and they'd rather have it than not have it. And the audiences are so fragmented, whether it's in print or on their websites, that they don't care if, even in the Bay Area, we'll have a story on the same day that might be in 5 or 6 newspapers, on public radio, on commercial television, and on multiple websites. So you're really seeing a saturation of audience. How we transform that large audience into revenue is something we can't answer right now. And we've just signed, and part of our challenge, and for every news organization, is understanding who and how large your audience is through the analytics and the metrics. For example, we have a site, and our model is not to be a destination site, but to push it out. So we might have 250,000, 300,000 unique visitors to our site a month. One of our stories could be on one of the larger websites, whether it's Huffington Post or a big metro paper, and that one story in one day might have 100,000, 150,000 uniques. We're not getting sort of the credit, but our funders, as opposed to wanting profit, want audience. They want impact. So the model for philanthropic support in the States is not about making money. It's about informing the public. It's about the traditional role of investigative reporting in a democracy. It's about audience, and the next challenge from their point of view is quote-unquote engagement. How do you get people involved in an issue? How do you get them potentially not only to be informed, but to take action? Historically, as journalists, a lot of us have shied away from quote-unquote solutions, but we're really trying to master that. How do you bring people together, especially through social media, who care about an issue either by geography or subject matter? So these are all things we're trying to figure out and experiment with. But I think the beauty of what we're doing is we've created a new organization where this is just what we do, rather than try and stuff it down the throats of people who said we don't do that in traditional newsrooms, which is what I come from. As you all know, change in any news organization or any organization is really difficult. But if you're creating something new, this is how we're doing it. And we're very nimble. We can say we're doing this and we're going to go in a different direction. So this is not only the journalism, it's also really trying to build, and it's in a startup sort of energy of experimentation and trying new things, but it always comes back to a good story.
I just recently went to Page One, which is pretty much the demise of print media, of the New York Times. And they were talking about what you were just saying, how print media is going through so much change. And I worry as a young journalist, and wanting to be a good young journalist, what is the open media, and what does that mean to an investigative journalist, and how do I get a source that I know is the right source? Like Judith Miller, you know, she made these amazing, beautiful, scripted articles about after 9/11 and really created a war from it. And I just worry about open media because there is so much change and there is no regulatory body that is, watching it. What do you see the future, and do you see there's any negative effect of open media? I mean, I'm all for it. I like Huffington Post. I worry.
Well, I think that, historically, information, disinformation, accuracy errors happens. You talk about the New York Times and Judith Miller. I wasn't in that newsroom, but there were a lot of people who didn't believe or print some of those stories. A lot of them, if you really look back at them, were single-sourced, and that's a sorry episode. And the whole American press corps, I guess, media, has been taken to task justifiably as a unit, as a whole, for not doing a better job. I think there's not much we can do about if I understand open media. It's just anybody can be a publisher. Is the access to information, the ability to put out accurate information, disinformation, not fact-checking, is just something we're going to have to deal with. And I think that it's both an opportunity and a great danger. And I think from a consumer's point of view, it's really going to be important that you believe that some news organizations have more credibility than others. At the same time, we're seeing a siloing of news organizations where people go to the source that they feel good about because they agree with it. So I don't pretend to have an answer, but I think in our small way, we're trying to be a credible source of information that doesn't have an agenda. And what we're seeing is that many big publishers want our content and partner with us because we're perceived that way. But we're in a period of time where the ability to manipulate and control information is greater than ever before. And if you look back in history at regimes, whether it's the control of information that is central to totalitarian states functioning, and the people who oppose that or try and challenge that kind of storyline frequently have been journalists, and they're the first people who are eliminated. We're all involved in a profession where you can be imprisoned, beaten, killed because you're a journalist. There aren't many professions besides law enforcement where you're potentially at risk. So in a sense, it's a calling. In Australia, the model with ABC is pretty unique. There are issues around that. In the States now, you have the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. But my own personal view is it's really crucial in terms of democratic practices to have investigative reporting, to have journalists who can challenge authority, but also cover things. One of the great problems in the States right now with the downsizing is that so many local governments, courts, police agencies, there's no reporting. No one knows what they're really doing. So I think as we're going forward, in terms of being a young journalist in the future, I think the role is going to be actually more important. And what the structure exactly is of how information is vetted and put out there is something we're all going to be part of answering. I feel, this period of the last 10 years, last 15 years, historically is probably one of some of the greatest changes in terms of information and technology that's ever happened in history. We're sort of in the middle of it. We're in the petri dish now. Some of you will be around in 40 years and you'll look back and see sort of how this evolves. But, I'm not standing here telling you I have an answer. I'm telling you that I'm in the game, and we're trying. And what I'm doing and what I'm trying to do is based on a lot of my own experience in terms of credibility and standards and managing people and really trying to get at, quote unquote, the truth without a perception of bias. But I certainly don't have the answers. But what I do is really support risk-taking and innovation and what I call, the younger generation, who I hope I can teach and help shape. But I think I'm as much a student of what they're doing and open to almost anything. So that's a really big difference. And I think in the best of all worlds, we would have venture money to play and experiment and not be worried about the future. I mentioned we've grown tremendously But I can tell you right now, we're on the edge. I don't know if we're going to secure the funding from the foundations over the next 2 or 3 years to really do some of the things I think we can do that might sustain and support all journalists, not just at CIR. So we're really, trying not to do these things for ourselves, but we're trying to do it really for journalism. And some of our funders, quote unquote, call us a transformational model, and they understand that. But I think the question you answered is really central for all of us to try and figure out, and we're all going to be part of the answer. Question?
I was wondering, given how labour-intensive that your work is, and potentially looking through thousands of digital documents, and also given that we're hearing a lot about this excess time, people prepared to work for free, spending millions of hours in gaming or whatever, and potentially investigative journalism. To what extent outside your core stuff of 35 are you tapping into that sort of broader intelligence, and how do you see the dynamic between professional and citizen evolving?
I think it's really crucial because we have the ability to reach out and get information from an incredibly diverse community. There's something in the States called the Public Insight Network, PIN, which was started by American Public Media out of Minnesota. You should look it up. And it's actually a managed social network where the goal is for citizens, people who want to work with journalists, to join up and ask them questions. And you really have a range of people who can be your sources. But I think that the answer to the bigger, broader question is you can't just say you want to do that. You have to set up an infrastructure to manage the information you get in, especially around investigative reporting. If we were asking for information about the best place to walk your dog, it would be a lot easier, or a neighborhood restaurant or coffee shop you really like. But if you're really doing work that we do, and it's also very vulnerable to legal action, you really have to figure out a way to vet the content and vet the information and enlist people who you hope can help you. But I think it's crucial philosophically and strategically to have that as really a core part of your community. And I can tell you, I think we can do it better. And large news organizations are trying to do that more consistently and can do it. But I think that we have to, again, the technology has created an opportunity that never existed. When I was a young reporter, I took my notebook and I went to the story. And the reporters who sat in the newsroom and waited for the phone to ring never got as good a story as someone who went to the story. So now we can go to the community, they can come to us. At the same time, you have to physically, I think, be out there as well, because your story is always better when you go to the scene of it. And I think that's something that's been lost quite a bit. And it's really, really crucial, because you can rely on the computer to do a lot of things. You can access information, but you still have to have the sources. The key thing to the best investigative reporting is a source. You can go think you're going to look for something and find the needle in the haystack, but you get that one phone call, that one email, a document dump. You need the people inside to help frame it and give you the context. And one of the things that they're the ones frequently who are taking the most risk, personally, because of either legal actions or threats or losing their job. So these are things I think we all have to think about, and they're traditional as well as in the new model. But if you're covering an agency, people have to see your face and know who you are, or read your byline, or hear you on radio, or see you on TV. If they trust you and think you're relaying accurately what's happening within their organization, that's your best chance of getting information that you may never get.
Hi, I'm just wondering how easy it is for startup investigative centres in the States to get non-profit status, and also what kind of restrictions are on them for making a profit. I run a news website here, a very small one, called New Matilda. It's crowdfunded, and one of the restrictions that we face is that it's actually very difficult here to get non-profit status, and we're a private company, so any donation that we get, 10% of it goes in GST, and also anyone who donates to us they obviously can't claim that donation on tax. I'm just wondering if you can explain the differences.
Yeah, a 501c3 is the IRS, the tax code ruling. It can be complicated. CIR got it a long time ago. And if someone gives us a donation, they can use it as a tax deduction. We can bring in revenue to support the work, but we can't bring in more than about 60% of revenue. Then we might have to shift to a for-profit. At the same time, there's a new tax law called an LC3 in some states where you can be a nonprofit and can create a for-profit wing to support the nonprofit. We can charge, and in fact, we're supposed to charge a for-profit. In other words, we're not supposed to be a nonprofit that supports for-profit journalism. So when we begin charging a for-profit organization, they in a sense have to pay us or should pay us, but it's very murky. And it is complicated in the States, and it's getting harder and harder. The other key thing, that you're supposed to be quote-unquote nonpartisan. And that's being blurred quite a bit in the political climate in the States now, where if you really look at the funding, some of the new organizations from the right or the left have one or two funders who clearly have a political agenda. And with the new IRS tax laws on contributions, it's getting harder and harder to find the source. But for our model, it's crucial to have multiple sources of funding, not just one or two, and not just big foundations, but also individuals. And one of the things that's happening in the States, you're probably familiar with ProPublica, where the Sandler family really put up a lot of money, more than $10 million a year, to start a nonprofit investigative news organization. But they need to diversify their funding. And there are people who are very wealthy who are willing to support this kind of work as well, as long as it's a nonprofit. So, if we came up with something that really generated a lot of money, we would have to create a for-profit wing. And, we'd be thrilled to do that, but I don't think it's happening in the short term.
I suppose what we all share as investigative journalists is that we hope to translate exposing an issue to a call for action. So I was wondering, when it comes to transparency and exposing something that you might think is important, where do you draw the line between, I suppose, becoming a fearmongerer or exposing something that you think is important, but it does elicit a fear in the public, not to discredit that, they can't make the call for themselves?
Well, I think it's in the storytelling, and we all know sometimes you can do a big investigative story and it just lands like a big thump and nothing happens, which doesn't feel good. At the same time, if you're creating stories that lead to changes in legislation or government action or really engages a community, it's tremendously rewarding. And not everything is going to be the Pentagon Papers or Watergate. But I think one of the things we're trying to do is we do something where we call a react and act. Like with the SARS report, we gave a guide for people without saying anything. If you want to know if your police agency has a suspicious activity report on you, here's how you go about trying to get that. So I think it's central to what you want to do, but at the same time, you don't want to be extreme. I think you lose credibility. And the other thing that's really challenging, frequently we did a huge investigation on seismic safety in schools in California. And really the concept of the idea came from a school collapsing in China where hundreds of kids were killed. We're obviously an earthquake country. But we did this story before the disaster. If a school collapsed in any of your communities for any reason, after the fact, everybody would be in there looking at records, looking at housing codes, looking at who the contractors were, who built it, was it shoddy cement, whatever, was it on a fault line. So we did this story before the disaster. In other words, it was clear. We had an interactive database with over 10,000 schools. It was 19 months. We got records no one even knew existed, and a funny story about a good investigative reporter. One of the researchers called one of the state agencies, one of our researchers, called the state agency looking for some records for the core reporter. And the person in the state office said, well, we don't know that, but there's this reporter named Corey Johnson who works at CIR who has all the answers. And that's a pretty good compliment. But as a result of that story, there was legislation, there was changes, and there was an impact. So your question is a really good one, but I think if you're doing credible work, you're not going to be seen as hysterical, not to be seen as alarmist. But at the same time, information is frequently not believed, even if from the government or from wherever. I was reading something last night when I couldn't sleep about the Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge and all the warnings that came out prior to their taking over. People didn't believe it. If you go back and look at, and there was no journalists in there, obviously. There was no independent. You look at Syria right now. We sort of know it's happening, but we don't have independent verification. So the role of journalists, whether it's investigative reporting or disclosure and being a mirror and openness of what's happening, is really crucial. But the question you're asking gets, again, the credibility. And if a news organization consistently, over time, does the kind of work that holds up to criticism from the right or the left, leads to results, you know, that, to me, is the most important attribute you can have. It's your core credibility. One of the reasons I've been successful at CIR isn't because of me, it's because CIR has existed since '77 and has a reputation for doing accurate and fair work over a long period of time. So that's an asset you can't just create, and it's an asset that you have to really respect and protect.
Hi, I think my question is going to pick up on a couple of the things that the previous questions were asking as well. You talked a little bit in your presentation about now also, as journalists, starting to look towards how to investigate solutions, and that funders are interested in investigating solutions. At the same time, you're operating in a much more partisan, politically partisan media environment. I'm just wondering, how mature is the conversation about how to manage that situation with the funders themselves and amongst the different media outlets that you liaise with, and what are some of the nuances of trying to manage that?
You mean the solution part of that?
Well, how, if there is a greater emphasis on the part of funders and now more on your work as a journalist towards not just telling the story but looking for solutions, but that can be interpreted in a very politically partisan way. What are some of the elements in that discussion?
You have to be extremely careful to not allow your funders to dictate your stories. It's the same way in a traditional model in a newspaper. You don't want the advertisers to tell you what to do and what not to do. And that's when you get sometimes the most conflict with your publisher, if you're the editor or editors in a newsroom. The solution piece for traditional journalists is really hard, because, you know, you want to reveal, investigative reporters reveal the problem. In your reporting, what's the answer? The best investigative reporting has context. It really explains the systematic failure of something and why it doesn't work. And through that, you hope that it leads to a solution. I think now, and this is something I wouldn't have done when I was the editor of the Inquirer, for example, I think we have to push for the solution. And the solution may not come from us. It's using, to someone's earlier question, the public, whether you want to call them sources, whether you want to call them whatever you want to call them. How do you put the spotlight on an issue here? Why not go to the public and say, can you help answer these problems? It may be an environmental problem, it may be corrupt officials. You know, the public's not going to answer that, but they obviously can take action. But there are issues that people do have answers to. And I think people in this very complicated world where they feel overwhelmed by problems want someone to help them find answers. And I think it's a tricky dance, because someone will perceive bias in whatever you do. And as you all know, when you're doing investigative reporting, someone is going to come after you and try and tear it down. But again, over time, if you're only going after one party or one problem, you're going to lose credibility. And over time, if you're really going across the spectrum, then you're going to be seen as being fair. I mean, we're facing a political campaign in the United States where a couple of $1 billion may be raised. And with new Supreme Court rulings with the Citizens United, the ability to find who the sources are and the influence, where the influence is coming from, is going to be harder and harder. But I think it's really crucial for all of us to understand when legislation or issues are being pushed, you know, show the impact of the special interest. Who does it help? Who does it hurt? And maybe you're showing that it really benefited a broad majority of people. Those kinds of stories, that kind of information, when you're looking at as a whole around an issue, really do give you credibility. It's not easy to do. The best investigative reporters grab something by the throat and they think they're bastards and they're not going to let go. As an editor, you know, really pushing for the full story and stepping back is often very difficult. But I think in these new cultures, we really have to push to understand that, because the rules have changed so much, and the ability to get information and push it out very differently because of technology and evolving technology. We're in a new world. And, you know, if we're going to survive and thrive, we really have to adapt to the way the technology is shaping who we are and what we do. You know, a story from anybody, from a blogger in a little community, can go global like that. You know, we've seen it happen. So how do you adjust to that? And I think that's really got to be central to everybody's thinking as you're pursuing the core thing, which is the story.
Hi. I'm not so much interested in the story, but how you decide how you tell the story. So the animation is really quite an interesting way to present quite a complex story that could affect anyone. How do you guys make decisions about that? You are a not-for-profit, you obviously have commercial imperatives, but you don't have that kind of pressure about resources. Well, I'm sure you do actually, but you have the freedom to be a little bit more creative with it. How do you decide how you're going to tell a story?
Well, to our model, and I mentioned earlier the spokes of the wheel, so if we start an investigative story, and you all, if you're in a newsroom, from the very early days or moments, you create a team around something is going to take a while. And I'll go back in my history. Some of you are probably familiar with the Black Hawk Down story. Well, when I was at the Inquirer, I don't know if I was the editor or the managing editor or whatever, but we did Black Hawk Down, 1997. And at that point, the website was new, and at the Inquirer, which had a great tradition of investigative reporting and, won more Pulitzers than any paper in the country over about a 12-year period, we created teams. But in the newspaper, you'd have the reporter, you'd have the editor, you might have a photo editor, you might have a designer, a graphic person from the beginning, and you'd sort of push to the end of the story. Well, with the internet, I remember when we had our first meetings around Black Hawk Down. At that meeting, we had a videographer, we had the web person, and I didn't really understand any of this, and we had Mark Bowden, the reporter, an editor, and we were talking about how we would do this. And I knew Mark would write a book, which he did, because he wrote long, but I also knew he'd deliver the story. And I remember I turned to the web people, and I said, well, what can we do on the internet? We have this website. And they said, anything. And I said, anything? What does that mean? He said, well, we can get video, we can get audio up. When I was a reporter, I'd always try and get a picture or a document, put in the paper. So I turned to Mark and said, well, see if you can get audio or video of the battle. all these special forces guys. Well, if you go back and look at that website, we did a documentary that was broadcast on the website. We had that Black Hawk Down audio. We had the greeny grain stuff from the night vision goggles when they filmed it. We had the print story. We had the video. And Mark did live chats where you had special forces guys arguing with gunmen from Mogadishu. It was pretty remarkable, really ahead of its time. So that informed me when I got to CIR. So when we start a project, at the table, in the meeting, are all the different disciplines. Now, I'm not going to tell someone from radio how to do a radio story, but I want them to take that core story and turn it into radio. If we have a videographer there, I'm not going to tell the videographer, or the editors, not me, how to do the video, but they're taking the information and distilling it into their platform. If we're going to have someone doing the animation, they're thinking about how do I turn this story into an animation. So you have all these multiple disciplines at the table. And some stories, the radio person will say, that's so document-driven, I need sound. I can't get any sound for that. I can't do this. The reporter can be on an interview and we can talk to them. The same with video. We might not be able to get any sources who are going to go on camera. So some of what's available informs the process. The multimedia people, the people who are doing the interactive maps, they're involved from the very beginning, getting the data they need, creating the mapping tools. So you're really, again, creating, and I mentioned earlier, a team concept, a team approach. And what it really is important is trust. Because if any of you are hardcore investigative reporters, you're not telling anybody what you're doing, even your editors sometimes, because you don't trust them. So this is really a different way to do it. If you're working with outside news organizations, there's tremendous resistance frequently initially, but over time it's around trust. And I can tell you in a candid way, a lot of this really starts with personal relationships with the top people, and then really telling the staff and creating a staff that's open to this. So it's really a different way to do it. When I was running the newspapers, I was as competitive as anybody. We wanted it first, we wanted it alone. That almost doesn't matter now, because now what we're trying to do is we want impact. We want the story to get out there. That's the most important thing. If it's branded with us, if it's distributed, and people are aware of what we're doing, that's crucial to our success. But it's a very different model, and the product or the content creation is really a process of team involvement with central editing and vetting of everything for accuracy and making sure facts. When we work with NPR, we review their scripts. We listen to their audio. And we don't tell them, we don't like this interview, but we'll say this fact is off in our print story. Let's make sure all this matches. And actually, in reporting that story, we were moving with teams of people, with print and radio sometimes going to an interview, or maybe a videographer coming in. So it's a really different way of doing it, but again, the results are very good stories that frequently reach a big audience. And we are, not in any sense loaded with cash. I mean, we do this as tightly as we can. That animation was done with staff time, and we paid the freelance animator, Arthur Jones, $4,000. And it took him probably a month to do that. And was getting constant feedback from us and the script. In an ideal world, we might have somebody in-house to do that. We'd have to raise funds. The other, I can go off on a whole bunch of tangents on things we're trying, but I think that answers your question. And we're getting...
I'm sure we've got lots more questions, and there will be an opportunity shortly, but we'll have a short break in a moment and come back for our panel. But first of all, would you please thank very warmly indeed Robert Rosenthal.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay.